Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. In the virtual studio today, we have Jim Richberg. He's a public sector field CISO and Vice President of Information Security at a company called Fortinet, Fortinet. Kind of a well-known company. People kind of know what Fortinet is, been around a while, very well-established reputation in the area. Now, I've done a bunch of podcasts, and the last couple of podcasts I've done, maybe I've gotten into the weeds a little bit. I mean, I did a deep dive on, data at rest versus data in use, security and encryption in data in transit. That may have got a little boring. And so sometimes I have to maybe pull up to 40,000 feet and get a bigger perspective. So Jim's a perfect guy for that. I went to his LinkedIn profile and it took me a half hour to read it. He's been everywhere, done it. He's kind of like Forrest Gump. Yeah, I've been there, did this, did that, Stanford, here, there, MIT, CIA. And so I'm not even going to give you his background. What you're going to do is, it's okay, you've got his great background, Jim. Give me the 40,000 foot perspective on what's going on in the federal government today. And what I see people talking about is the national cybersecurity strategy. Now, this is a guy who's done tactics and strategy, been inside the government, outside the government. So, Jim, is this just something that every single, president administration does? Is this something new? Is this like, whistling against the wind? Is this something that's going to actually come to fruition? So give me your 2 cents from 40,000 feet.
So, gee, John, I thought we were going to go talk about data in motion at 40,000 feet.
Oh, I've done that too many times.
I guess we'll talk about the national strategy instead. Well,
yeah.
The reality is virtually every administration does put out a national security strategy. And then they put out other strategies that support that. But that's their vision for how do they protect the United States. So they'll put out a national security strategy, and then the Defense Department will put out a defense strategy. My former community will put out an intelligence strategy. I then had to put out a cyber intelligence strategy. So they all nest together. And for the last several administrations, we have had separate national cybersecurity strategies, which ideally map to that national security strategy. And of course, this national security strategy was talking about it's a scary world. We now have a change in, what was, great power competition, different visions of the internet, things like that are in the national security strategy, and that they fold into the national cybersecurity strategy that President Biden released in March as well. Now, if you look at that national cybersecurity strategy, it's an admittedly complicated document. I mean, it's organized around 6 thematic pillars, and it contains nearly 70 specific initiatives. And it's easy to get overwhelmed by all those details, Sean. But the reality is, if you read it, the bulk of the document's actions are actually directed at the executive branch of the U.S. government, which actually makes a ton of sense as somebody who's been involved in creating or implementing a dozen odd strategies, because what's the one audience who really has to pay attention to the president? He's the chief executive. That's the executive branch. So if you're doing a strategy, ideally you want to have a lot of that strategy be directed at people who have to pay attention to what you're saying. And most of those government-focused initiatives are not, in fact, new, which again makes a lot of sense, John, because in my experience, having, again, been part of a lot of strategies in my 30-plus years in government, 2 factors distinguished a strategy that was likely to be successfully implemented from something that was going to become shelfware, where people would look at it later and say, oh, yeah, we wrote one of those, didn't we? And the 2 things are, number one, that much of that strategy is evolutionary, not revolutionary. I mean, it's okay once in a while to have a strategy that says, hey, brainstorm. Instead of going north, we need to go south. But you don't do that too often. I mean, once in a while, those are paradigm shifts. Normally, a strategy is a way of organizing and orchestrating what you're doing, putting a more strategic chapeau around what otherwise looks like a bunch of disparate stovepipes. And the second thing for a government strategy in particular is it's more likely to be implemented if most of the activities it describes don't require new funding to accomplish. If you have a strategy that has a whole bunch of things that would be considered new starts in budgetary terms, number one, you have to get them through Congress. Number two, if you have a continuing resolution, you can't do a new start. So who wants a strategy where you say yes, and if Congress would fund it, we could start it? So rather, this strategy is a thematic way of wrapping together a lot of things government is doing and adding some other content as well.
So, Jim, I'm about a 1/10 as smart as you are, and maybe 1/50th your experience. But when I read this and try to, maybe highlight something, remember back in the day with paper and highlighters, you'd highlight something. The thing that highlight it was like, it's called shift liability. It's like, oh, okay. Guess what? Old Jim's got to step up to the plate now because he's responsible for Jim software. Is that evolution or is that new? I mean, that seems like something radically different.
As I said, there are parts of this, a strategy that is mostly evolutionary, but has some things that are a departure. And this strategy was predicated on the idea that we have had a market failure when it comes to cybersecurity. Doing cybersecurity has been something that some companies did because they felt it was the right thing to do or they'd been attacked, and other companies didn't. Now, if you're just, Acme company producing your little widgets and you fail to do it securely, and that affects you and your customers. On the other hand, if you're a utility that provides power to the East Coast, your failure is collective failure. That's what makes you part of critical infrastructure. And this strategy said it's time to level the playing field. It's time to mainstream cybersecurity. It's time to not make it optional for the organizations that are in cybersecurity. And the strategy is really about trying to build systemic resilience, to say nobody has got perfect cybersecurity. People make mistakes. Adversaries are adaptive and nimble. Sometimes they get lucky. So rather than try to have cyber perfection, find ways of building down the risk. And this strategy does seek to do a fundamental shift, John, in the sense that it says, we want to move the risk in the ecosystem from the end user, which can be small and medium business as well, to those who are systemically more able to absorb it. And that would be the big companies that produce IT and communication solutions. So people often throw around the metaphor of automotive safety, and they say, we used to just say the way to have fewer auto fatalities is people just have to drive safely. It's all about the driver's responsibility. And I'm talking about the 1950s. Yeah. And then you had the book Unsafe at Any Speed that showed there were actually cars that were designed, was known they had flaws that made them unstable. We didn't have seatbelts. So we started doing a lot of things. We had driver's ed come on in school. We had, anti-drunk driving campaigns, including stepped up law enforcement. We started literally building roads safer, including, devices that if you crash into them will give rather than impale you on a guardrail. But what really moved the needle more than anything else was when the manufacturers started making cars that were inherently more safe, and when they got sued, to your point of liability, for failing to make them safe. So yes, there's lots of moving parts to this, but arguably, if you really want to move the needle, you make the people who should be in a position to best understand it, the people making the products and services, responsible for it. And John, too often with cybersecurity, we have had this, let's rush an IT product to market because first to market's going to capture the market share, it's innovative, et cetera. And then security was almost an afterthought. We'll bolt that on. We'll take care of that in the first patch. And this was an attempt by this administration to say, no, we need to move the needle. Security needs to be part of this. Things need to be secure by design and delivered to the users in configurations that are secure by default. Now, you can go in and turn off all those options, but let's give it to you. Most people are, I won't say lazy, but we're creatures of habit. We will take a software product, we'll install it, we'll count ourselves lucky when we get it to run. We then don't go in and start tweaking all the security settings. So if you give it to people with all the security options turned on, that's probably the way they're going to use it. Long-winded answer to what that really is one of the fundamental departures of the strategy, John.
Years ago, when we were in grade school, I'm sure you took a health class and it said, eat a balanced diet. Okay. And I'm sure maybe you read articles where here's the pyramid and here's the balanced diet. And, I can say that, you could say that. And I'm sure if you're at an event, people, oh yeah, I work out too. And when I hear this phrase public-private partnership, it's 10 people, it means 10 different things. For some people, it means, oh yeah, that means something. Other people, and so that is another aspect, I think, of this strategy. And they are pointing their finger at CISA going, hey, CISA, you're up to bat here. You've got to take and promote some of this public-private partnership in order to maybe to develop. And so is this something that's just a palaver? Is this just something that's written on the wall somewhere? Or is this actually think it's going to be a change? Because it doesn't cost anything, so maybe it's underpowered too.
Well, public-private partnership is going to be absolutely integral to this strategy. I talked about most of the initiatives were focused on the U.S. government, but that means they have action on moving them forward. That doesn't mean success is entirely contingent on how well the government does. So, for instance, secure by design, secure by default, I've said, is one of the big departures of this. And yes, CISA has the pen on this. This is something that applies to all 16 critical infrastructures. They all need to bake cybersecurity into it. But what's the one that delivers the products that they all live on in this digital world? The IT and communications people. So CISA is pointing the finger directly at us. And I'm actually one of the leaders, co-leaders of the industry effort on saying, okay, how do we take this high-sounding good phrase like eat a healthy diet, deliver secure products? How do we operationalize that in a fashion that we can do that isn't going to drive us to bankruptcy, that's going to make a difference? So we're actively working on that very intensely with CISA right now. So they're putting effort where the words are right now. But on the broader issue, John, of public-private partnership, the reality is most of the technology innovation comes from the private sector. We remember the Cold War where, yes, things like, transistor and all that were really coming out of government-funded effort. We're now in an era where, other than, little niches in my former world of national security and intelligence where we succeed because we can do mission impossible, private sector is driving things. They have more money. They have, on balance, more smart people than government does. So the innovation tends to come from the private sector. On the other hand, things like the frameworks for cybersecurity tend to come from government. I was one of the people who helped put together the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, cybersecurity framework in 2014. If you had ever told me that cybersecurity professionals around the world would think of the functions identify, detect, protect, respond, recover that we were putting together for government, I would have said you're crazy. But the reality is government does a good job putting together conceptual frameworks that are technology and threat and vendor agnostic. They did the same thing on Zero Trust. They really came up with the concepts that became Zero Trust. The private sector or marketing firms stuck what frankly is an unhelpful label on this. But government, what I'm saying, John, is there's a good partnership here. A lot of the smart thinking on actual solutions will come from the private sector. But a way to get beyond any one company's reach and say, here's a broader perspective on this, that often comes from governments, organizations like NIST or even CISA, as you said. Another element in cyber, John, where public-private partnership is integral, and I've heard government increasingly recognize it, is on sharing information about threats. The private sector, a company like Fortinet, sees way more threat information even than the big three-letter agency organizations in the world I come from did. They're in different places. They're with people's consent. They're customers. Now, they're not spying on them, as we would say government could be doing. But the reality is both sides, public and private sector, see something about cyber threats, and you need to find a way to share it. And you've got constructs that have been put together like the JCDC, which is not a throwback 70s rock band. It's the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. We've talked when we were at war in sandy places about the need to get to the left of boom, the detonation of the IED. If you wanted to defeat it, it was not by having a harder vehicle. It was knowing where it was going to be, disrupting the planners. We try to do the same thing now on cyber. JCDC is a way of saying, rather than bring the private sector in for cleanup on aisle 5, there's been a major cyber breach that affects them as well as us. Let's do smarter planning. Let's systemically solve some of these things. Let's say, hey, I see part of this, you see part of that. We put it together. It's a threat, and here's how we can solve it. Whether government doing law enforcement, whether the private sector saying, well, I can make that vulnerability go away by designing it out of the new. So, yeah, John, public-private sector partnership is absolutely critical to solving this problem.
We began this interview with me being kind of jovial and talking about 40,000 feet. Well, let's go down the ground. Let's go down to my backyard. In my backyard, I have a pond and a waterfall, and the pump failed. So I went online, just like Jim would do, and I got a replacement pump. It's going to come in tomorrow. And I've never put a pump in a pond before. I have no idea. I know there's electricity involved, and it's going to fitting. And so it was pretty easy for me to find it online. I found it in like, I don't know, five seconds. It was bang. Put in the gallons per hour, bang, it's right there. And it's delivered the next day. That's easy. So coming up with a strategy, my strategy is to put in a pond pump. But, I may have to call you up on Saturday morning and go, hey, Big Jim, come on down and help me. I cannot implement the installation of this. So there's the implementation question that we're sitting on. I love strategies. Hey, eat a good breakfast, work out every day, run 10 miles a day. But then it comes down to the reality at 6 o'clock in the morning and you don't want to go to bed. You're not going to run 10 miles. You're going to run 2 miles. So what about implementation of all this? Is this something a fairy tale? Is this actually going to happen? I mean, they have some measurement here involved in it. So what about implementation?
So first off, John, you're going to get banner ads on pumps for the next year.
The rest of my life.
This new pump will have died, and you'll still be getting, banner.
I'll get Jim Richberg's pump company on my front door. Hi, I'm Jim. Yeah. You want to buy a pump? Yeah, I bought one.
Yeah. So, as I said, this strategy has an advantage in that a lot of the activities it describes are things that are already ongoing by government. It's a way of saying, oh, I see what Department A, Department B, Department C were doing, and they all look like separate things, and they are, but they all fit together under one of these pillars, whether it was defend critical infrastructure, whether it was change the ecosystem. So the implementation plan was just released by the administration not 2 weeks ago from when we're actually taping this. And it talked about which agency has the lead on which initiative and when they're supposed to do it. And you looked at it and said, wow, there was, for instance, an initiative here on the government, they reserve the right to do more regulation, the R word, the thing that scares people in the private sector. But that's sort of the tool of last resort. They want to use incentives to do it. So boom, last week, because the other part of the R word was it said, we hear the private sector say we have too many cybersecurity regulations from the federal government. We don't want to respond to 12 separate things when a bad thing happens. Sometimes they even tell us to do contradictory things. So what was one of the activities? Regulatory harmonization and deconfliction. That's already come out as a request for information from the private sector. Government says, we know it's a problem. Tell us how. So, John, my point is some parts of the strategy are already being implemented. There was something that said, one of the things people have said in cybersecurity is if I'm looking for that pond pump, John, I have no idea which of them are cyber secure and which of them aren't. You might actually make this be an Internet of Things device that can report into your phone and say, hey, John, I'm overheating and I'm going to fail. You might like that. You wouldn't like the fact that it might be able to go into your phone and steal your banking information. So you would like to know if I'm buying an Internet of Things connected pump, is it upgradable? Is it secure? And the reality is right now, it's really hard to look for that, to know that, even if you go to the manufacturer's website and try to do it. So we were looking for the equivalent of something that would provide something like the Energy Star rating, but security for IoT devices. Federal Communications Commission already started to release something on this last week. So, this strategy is not just shelfware. You've actually got very demonstrable steps that will be impactful that are already being taken by some of the departments and agencies. If you look at the implementation plan that was released, it literally gives you a roadmap of who's got the pen and what their timeline is for 65 of the initiatives in the strategy. It's actually a very comprehensive roadmap, and it even says ONCD, let's throw another four-letter one in there, the Office of the National Cyber Director, which was the principal author of this strategy, has got responsibility for overseeing implementation, for reporting to the president on how it's doing, for incorporating lessons learned. Well, this one seemed like a good idea, hasn't worked, let's fold that in. And for working with the Office of Management and Budget on budgetary guidance. And having been one of the overseers of a previous whole of government cyber activity under Presidents Bush and Obama, this is a lesson learned. They're benefiting from some of the things we were unable to do. So yeah, I look at the strategy and go, they really are doing things on implementation that I think will make this a more achievable strategy.
Okay, Jim, let's say we find a room with a whiteboard and I write out all 65 actions. And then I hand you a red marker and I go, okay, Jim, you have written standards, you have implemented standards, you've been frustrated with standards, you've seen standards successful, standards fail. And so it's the final question here, what do you think will be the most consequential in the near term and implementation here of all these actions to take? They're all important. Well, Jim's seen some. What are maybe one or two that maybe move up on the list?
So it's that old triad of, you have cheap, quick, and effective, and pick two. Consequential versus near term, I think are going to be different. Now, if you want to talk about who's going to be most affected, the IT sector is arguably in the short term going to be one of the most affected. This whole idea of secure by design, secure by default, which nests with other things. This whole idea of, you may have heard the phrase SBOM, software bill of materials, the idea that for code, we don't have the equivalent of an ingredient label. We don't know what goes into a piece of, to a software program. And yet a lot of those are software modules that are being recycled. So there's a lot that will affect the IT sector, voluntary standards. But the thing is, if it starts creating expectations by your customers, by the other critical infrastructures, then that becomes something that I think is very impactful. Shifting liability for software security is one that they have in there. And I joke that if you want to make quick progress on an issue, John, sick the lawyers on it. Mm-hmm. You want to make long-term progress on it, let the engineers do it. Boy, you want to move the needle in the short term, you make a liability. I mean, what changed corporate behavior on liability was something like Sarbanes-Oxley about saying, hey, you guys individually may have civil and criminal liability for that changed corporate behavior very quickly. So there are multiple ways I think that they'll try to shift liability for software, but it's a way of saying it shouldn't be the user shouldn't be the one who has to put everything together, make it work, and then make it secure as well. Shame on you. It's like saying, here, John, here's a car. You go put the safety features on it and make it all work. And that one I think is going to be very impactful. And I'll throw a final one in there, John, which is asleep, because towards the end of the strategy, there's something that says support for cyber-informed engineering principles. And, the National Cyber Director was Chris Inglis. He left shortly after right around the time the strategy was released. And I think this is one of Chris's personal touches in the strategy, because he used to talk about, he was an engineer. When he was trained as an engineer, your engineering training didn't include things like environmental impact and safety. I mean, it wasn't your responsibility if what you made turned out to be a polluting device or an unsafe one. That was somebody else who you designed to specification. Now, environmental impact and safety are taught in all engineering disciplines. It's part of your fundamental job. And he's hoping, I think, with this cyber-informed engineering principles to do the same thing, to say everybody who's designing something now should have had cybersecurity as a part of their engineering training. So again, it shouldn't just be a matter of saying, this is the CISO's job in the company, or this is, that part of the product team. No, it should be something where if you're thinking about how to solve a problem, cybersecurity should be one of the criteria you're trying to address.
I want to end this interview with a reference made to SBOM. I spent 25 years on doing live radio on NPR. And I did everything humanly possible to avoid any S-bombs. And I think I did because the FCC didn't come down on me for any S-bomb at all.
At least we tried to define them, but we S-bombed and we JCDC'd and we were right up there with the best. But we do define our acronyms.
Good. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Jim Richberg, Public Sector Field CISO and VP of Information Security for Fortinet. Thank you, Jim.
My pleasure, John. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.